Good afternoon, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So if I could please ask everyone to take a seat and we can maybe get going, that'd be great. Because I think they've told me that I got to stay on schedule. So I want to make sure that we save enough time for Q&A and address any question that you all might have. So again, many of you actually who've either been following Plug or who've been listening to Plug, a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about here is really not going to come as a surprise. We've been discussing some of these items for quite some time in terms of how we're looking to build out the green hydrogen generation network, both in US as well as in Europe. And I'm sure many of you probably have a question about what learnings have we had from Georgia. Obviously, it's taken longer than we thought. But at the same time, it's also been a positive in a way, which is we've learned so much from that we can really now take that know-how and, in fact, leverage that learnings for Texas, for New York, for many more plants that we're looking to build. Because I think the learnings have been such that, we're building first-of-a-kind plant that has never been done before. There are things we've learned. There are things we've found. Some we knew. Some, frankly, we didn't. And we've learned from that and gotten better at it, right? So with that, there's Paul as well. So figured I'd get started here. But again, forward-looking statements, so let's skip this. And this is, again, look, nothing new here, folks, right? We've been talking about how we want to have Georgia, Tennessee, obviously is our operating plant. The next one that comes online is Louisiana. The one after that comes online is going to be Texas. The one after that is going to be New York. And we've got multiple activity going on in the middle of the country as well as in the western part of the country. And another thing you will all see happening in terms of building this green hydrogen generation network in North America is the size of the plants are going to get larger. Our plant in Georgia is 15 tons. We're looking to expand that to 30. Obviously, our plant in Louisiana is 15 ton, but other plants are going to get bigger. We're going to start to think about optimizing our electrolyzer design, really getting into 30 ton as a minimum plant size, and that actually ends up going more to 60 tons, potentially 90 tons. And don't be surprised if we start to talk about 120 ton liquid plant. And by the second half of this decade, with some of the work we have going on, we fully anticipate that there is a path for having a kiloton plant that is actually going to be supported by 2.5 gigawatt of electrolyzer, massive hybrid solar and wind plant. So that's what you should think about when you think about how this green hydrogen build out unfolds here in North America. And again, some of you might have been in this session before. Benjamin certainly talked about all the things that he's doing in Europe, starting out with Port of Antwerp, then going to obviously our Acciona JV, then lots of things that we're doing in Finland. And I asked my buddy Paul to join as well, because I think many of you also have a question on not just what we're building, but one, how we're going to fund it. What is the capital efficiency going to look like? And again, so I just want to pause here for 1 second, because there's a lot here in this slide, I feel like. So today, we're obviously doing 100% equity financing. Right? That's what we're doing, because we're actually building this plant. Our FID decision is driven by the fact that we know what that demand looks like, based on our demand coming from our existing customers like the Amazons of the world, the Walmarts of the world, Home Depots of the world, and the hydrogen generation network in US has been very fragile. There's been a lot of force majeure, so we know what that demand looks like, which is why we felt comfortable enough that this is something new. Nobody's done it before, so the best way to do that was learn from it, put it on your balance sheet, and that's what you do. But that is really going to allow us to then go down the path of getting some of the, some other co-equity investors. And you all heard us talk about this morning with our MOU with Fortescue, things like that is going to actually reduce the amount of the capital, sponsor capital, that we need to put to build these plants. But going forward, you're going to start to see us talk more about project debt, private debt, back leverage, and there's two ways to do that, right? So if we do build, own, operate model, there's going to be a very credible long-term offtake, especially if you start to then sell that hydrogen to like a refining industry, ammonia industry. There's going to be a long-term offtake that's going to allow you to go down the path of doing construction financing, as well as doing even back leverage. Another way to accomplish that project debt would be run the plant for 12 months. You have a cash flow that you can demonstrate. Then you can actually do either on the topco level or on a project level, depending on what the debt service coverage ratio looks like. That's how we're going to be able to really get the capital stack changing. But in the future, what's going to happen here is two things. One, your equity contribution is probably 20 to 30%. Your CapEx has gone from today, $10 million a ton, down to $6 million a ton, right? So we're spending all of that $10 million a ton in our balance sheet. Think about that as a $10 million number. Now, if we're doing $6 million a ton, 20% of that is 1.2. So that $10 million allows us to build, essentially 8 times more capacity once you actually get the structure right, once you get the CapEx right. And this is how we think it's all going to unfold, right? So today we're doing a lot of, there's a lot of training work, not just on building the plant, but also on type of the financing you can access, type of the debt market you can go after. But I think as you really start to think about, look, and another big thing that we got out of Georgia, folks, is not that we learned tremendously in terms of optimizing the system design, amount of the work you probably want to avoid on site. How do you want to really start thinking about the Lego blocks in terms of how you build this plant? Another thing we got from Georgia is no longer time and a material contract. We're actually getting a turnkey EPC as we build Texas from someone like Kiewit, which allows us to put a wrap around it. Now you can actually have a bankable structure, right? You actually have somebody like Kiewit standing behind your plant, almost like a secondary validation of an independent engineer for our electrolyzer product. Our liquefier product even helps us from a marketing of those products as well, right? So with that, I want to pause here, Paul, and I think we can take questions. Or if you want to add anything else, but did I miss anything?
No, I think Sanjay said it, but I'll give you the finance layman perspective. I mean, we're doing things that have never been done before. So, a lot of times when we go and we talk to partners and people who look at this, they'll say, it's a new asset class. It's green hydrogen's new. There's a lot of skepticism that's out there, and what I think the charts that Sanjay shows really shows us building that confidence. And Georgia's a great litmus test. And so turning that on and proving that out, A, that it works, and B, that we're able to generate that hydrogen at the cost structure that we anticipate we're getting. And by the way, we're already doing a little over 2 tons a day in gaseous hydrogen there now, so we can see the cost structure. It's real and tangible, and that becomes a sellable story that we can backlever that plant. But more importantly, it sets the stage for what's going to happen in the next plant. So, it's going to be an evolution. The good news, competitively, we're the only one doing this. The bad news is, from an industry standpoint, we're the only one doing this, and so it doesn't happen nearly as fast as you see, like you might have seen with solar and wind and others, but it will accelerate. And we're the level of interest. It's amazing. I've been here 9 years, and the inbound calls I get today of parties that want to participate in these programs and work with us is 1,000-fold from what I saw when I first joined here. So, it's a broad stroke picture as to how this will play, and the pace of that and exactly when and how will be something we'll noodle through. You're definitely going to see things happening in the next, between now and year end in terms of some announcements and things that we're working on. But it's the right picture to show in terms of telling the story where we're at and how this will play.
Yes, Colin.
Can you guys talk a little bit about site selection, kind of where you're at in terms of development sites? There's a big issue in renewables around interconnection and timing around that, and supplementing some of that with stability technology where you guys can play. You talked about water earlier today, and then there's also where you actually use the hydrogen.
Yeah.
In that truck installation, but address all those.
Yeah. So first, we're going to expand in Georgia is our overall thought process right now, right? So Georgia is likely going to go from being 15-ton plants to 30-ton plants. And, we want to make sure that we're also getting the reduction in the EPC benefit and hoping that we can actually go from time and material to a lump sum turnkey, right? That's a thought process. So, and then when we think about building the plant, right, Colin, I think the key consideration is really thinking through solar and wind capacity factor, first consideration. And again, I think, Andrew, you brought up a point, which is a valid one, that given what has happened to the cost of financing, some of the impact that you've seen in the yield curve world, right? So it is important that you're no longer just thinking about, you can't just take it for granted that renewable energy cost is going to continue to go down. You got to really make sure that you're being very thoughtful about site selection. So that's one piece, right? Second piece we do is, even though I think I just want to make this one point, I think many of you probably know this, but there's a lot of talk about, oh my God, where all the water is going to come from to produce all this hydrogen, right? It takes about 4 kilograms of water to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen, maybe 6, depending how you think about it. That's exactly the same amount of water you're using to do refining of gasoline right now. So if anything, 4 versus 6, this industry actually ends up saving the water, not the other way around, right? And I know that's not your question, but I just think it's worthwhile pointing that out. Now, second piece we think about, even in light of that, if you actually have access to city water, we will do that. But if we could actually have, like in one of our sites in California, we actually have access to all the wastewater. Like even in our site in Texas, we have access to all the wastewater, right? It actually costs a little bit more from the filtration perspective, but we think sustainability, given what we're trying to do, it is the right thing to do. Now, another big piece is, so we also try to think about it more from the perspective of what is the demand within 500 to 600 miles of driving radius. And the reason that's important is because it's about 11-hour driving distance for our truck drivers before they have to take a break. So otherwise, you're going to have to add team drivers, and that ends up adding more to the cost of that transportation, right? So what you should expect is we fully anticipate that we will have not one, but multiple plants in Texas. You should expect that, we're looking at some of the location in the middle of the country where you have a very high wind capacity factor. We have a lot of activity going on in the West Coast, and I'm actually, given that we haven't talked a lot about exactly which state and which location, so we also have a lot of activity going on in the middle of the country. We even have some other opportunity in the Southeast that we're looking at, right? So, and what you should expect though, Colin, is beyond site selection, price of electricity, access to substation, access to water, being able to expand further. Another thing we're also looking at really is bigger size plant, if you would, right? So you will actually start to see our plant. Don't be surprised if we tell you that we're building a 90-ton liquid plant in the middle of the country. Don't be surprised if we tell you that we're building a 120-ton plant in the middle of the country. And another effort we got going on also is on build, own, and operate model, which is another way to expand and get financing done much better, like Paul talked about, is building a dedicated electrolyzer farm, do a long-term offtake with, for example, a refinery. Like, for example, we're selling electrolyzer to Galp. That's for the oil and gas and refining application. We're doing some of that work here in the US as well. So there's a lot going, so that's how we're looking at it.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
I want to ask a related question, which is related to behind.
I might turn that question behind to you, though, my friend, since you know so much about this.
Well, it's like behind the meter construction of your own renewables, or interconnection with the grid infrastructure, and then use buying cheap sun and wind power wherever it's available in that region.
Yeah.
I know that the retail prices, it just kind of kills you with like almost triple the amount of wholesale prices. But maybe there should be some policy framework in which electrolyzers should get access to some wholesale rates or something like that. Are you working on any things like that? Especially if they can help with like curtailment and negative prices and things like this.
Right. I think so. Very valid point, right? Are we really actively working on something like that? It will really be Aaron and Tim if we're doing that, right, on that front. But I think, however, though, what we're trying to do, though, is, again, I think even when you talk about blue versus green, or when you just talk about green hydrogen and the quantum of the green hydrogen that we're going to need to decarbonize so many different industries, right, Jack? As you rightfully pointed out, there's so much curtailment that's already happening in California. But the tricky thing about really leveraging that right now is the tax equity structure that's already in place, right? Because you can't unwind that PPA and just tap into that curtailed electricity, right? There's just a lot of complexity from that financing standpoint, which is why what we're doing is, when I talk about our kiloton plant, hopefully by the end of this decade, and again, there's a lot of work that needs to go on, that is likely going to be behind the meter, that is likely going to be supported by hybrid plant, right, solar and wind. Maybe you get to 70% capacity factor, right? And we might not even actually choose to connect to the grid in that situation, right? And that is what we might want to do. But we will then actually think about that 1,000-ton gaseous hydrogen plant, move via pipeline, and you will then do some last mile liquefaction for that, right, to support some of the industries. And that's where nuclear becomes an interesting option when it's available, right? But God, it's a brilliant idea. I think India is actually working on something like that where they're bypassing all the T&D charges, especially if you're going to actually use that electricity to produce green hydrogen. I am not aware of any policy like that here, and but it's something I think we should absolutely explore. Yes, sir.
So I just want to try to connect this 2028 roadmap on the electrolyzer front versus the corporate targets of 35% gross margins and 13% OpEx level. Is that operating margin or operating cost as a percent of revenues?
So if you're doing 35% gross margin and you're doing 13% OpEx, then we get an operating income of roughly 22%. And we absolutely expect the next 18, 24 months we're moving into positive EPS, and it's in that trajectory where it gets to that math,
And how does this relate to whether you get more equity participation in the electrolyzer projects versus project debt?
Sure. So here's what I would tell you. This is, I mean, if you look at this timeline and you're growing to 1,000 tons per day, right? That's a massive number. I mean, we have 10 tons per day in Tennessee. We're just launching 15 tons per day in Georgia.
That's right.
So the way I would look at it is, you know, the first money in is probably the most expensive, and that's where we're going to use equity players, corporate debt solutions, and maybe some project financing solutions. The combination of those is obviously higher cost of capital. As you grow and scale and perfect it, you drive that down. When we did the Generate loan a few years ago, you know, I knocked on many doors and not many would take our calls. I did the Generate deal, and within a month, 12 lenders called me and said, I could have done that deal, I could have done that deal, right? So I think in context to your question, in the big scheme of it, it'll be a smaller portion. I personally, selfishly, don't want to give away any of the equity, right? I want all the upside. So I think it's a matter of scale and timing. There'll be some of the first plants that we do that with, but in the long run, I think we'll be in a position where we can finance the majority of it with, you know, efficiently with project finance. We'll always probably have some level of sponsor equity in the projects, but as I get up to scale and I'm generating positive cash flows and, you know, the ranges of capital that get available to me are much more efficient, we'll be in a position to do that. So that's the way I would think about it.
Are you able to share any next level of detail about what's happened at Georgia and what is left to accomplish that gives you confidence in the new window?
I can take that.
Go ahead.
Sure, absolutely, happy to. And Brent, keep me honest here because you're living it every day as well. So just Alan Sharkey, who runs our project execution, is actually at the site, right? So, and there's been tremendous amount of learnings that we have actually gone through. So I also wanted, while this has taken longer than what we had previously anticipated, but there's actually some pretty positive that have come out of it as well, right? And I'm not certainly trying to turn it into positive, by the way. We were able to really turn on our 5 megawatt electrolyzer skid within 24 hours, right? So we've already done that with 4 of them. That's 20 megawatt of electrolyzer. So you go through 3 stages, right? You ramp it up 30%, then you ramp it up 50%, then you ramp up the electrolyzer 100%. So you're actually producing at full capacity. We've done that with 20 megawatt of electrolyzer, which effectively actually produces about 8.8 tons of gaseous hydrogen, right? And then we're already doing the same thing, right? With a power logic control, getting them, you know, really starting to go to 30%, then 50%, then 100%, skid number 5, skid number 6, skid number 7, and skid number 8. We don't need all that to produce liquid hydrogen. And one of the thought process that we had was we were really thinking about it already a little bit like a Lego block, if you would, right? You get electrolyzer ramped up, you got your gaseous hydrogen. You go through the deoxo dryer, you got purified hydrogen, right? Then you got your compressor bank, and then you're ready to kind of then run the liquefier. We knew what time it takes for all of those components. And this is where, this was a big lesson learned, given that this has never been done before, and it's a first of a kind, is amount of the connectivity between electrolyzer, compressor bank, piping, tubing, cabling, and you had to check every single one of these loops. And you can't actually turn on something. One could argue, why didn't you run or do the bake-off or, you know, drying out of the cold box independently while you're ramping up the electrolyzer? Frankly, that's what I thought we might want to do, right? That's what we thought we might be able to do. But as you were doing it in the field, this I think is a difference of actually building a real plant versus sort of a CAD drawing and everything else. The amount of the valves and the loop test that we had to do, the number was something like 3,000 loops, Brent, right? So now we are essentially at less than 200 of those loops that needs to be tested before we can really start to have that gaseous hydrogen go into the cold box. And for the cold box, there is actually a dry out process that you have to go through, which essentially has about 8 total circuits. You have a perlite cold box and you have a vacuum cold box. There's 2 of those. Each of them have 5 and 3 circuits, and it takes anywhere between 3 to 5 days to do that, right? But you don't want to jump the gun on that, because if you actually insert moisture, insert impurity, you know, I mean, look, we're already kind of behind the schedule here. Now we got to get this right. You don't want to rush in terms of getting that cold box. So we're about to start that bake-off process, which could be 15 days or 25 days, right? And that's why Andy said we will be in a position to produce liquid between 15th of November to end of the year, right? So that's really, so we've done a lot of upstream work here already. Nitrogen compressor has already been commissioned, helium compressor is being commissioned, deoxo dryer is going through its cleanup process, right? So we already are doing all the loop check right before we get into this, drying out of the vacuum cold box, right? But these are pretty big capital equipment. You don't want to have any moisture go in there. What it could do is it could actually damage brazed aluminum heat exchanger, which then means we are 12 months behind, not 2 weeks behind, right? And that's why we felt like, given where we are, given everything that has happened here, it was the right thing to do. We're tantalizingly close. Now you should ask a question as to why should we feel confident and comfortable about the fact that we're going to get Texas right, we're going to get New York right, because now we know what to anticipate here, right? And one other thing that actually is a little bit, frankly, I think from a timing standpoint that might have impacted us is this is a time and a material contract rather than being a lump sum turnkey contract, right? So from an EPC contractor perspective, you got to kind of stay on top of them because for them it's time and material, right? Longer they're at the site, more they can get paid, So, there's been a lot of pushing that's going on. So with actually our Texas plant being lump sum turnkey, they are incentivized for early completion. Now we know how to anticipate all of this work that actually in fact has to happen in the field, right? So which is why it gives us, and again, when you really then think about the timing, there's at least 3 to 4 months of savings that can be had when we actually bring Texas online, which is why when we say Texas plant should come online by the end of next year or, late Q3, sometime in Q4 of 2024, that's why we feel comfortable saying that. I know that's a lot more detail, but I thought it was an important point for everybody to understand as to what has happened there, what it is, and again, I think there's nobody in our opinion that has actually energized and commissioned electrolyzer as quickly as we have actually done at our site in Georgia, right? So I don't want people to lose sight of that. It's been a phenomenal accomplishment from that perspective. But again, we've been trying to be more mindful and thoughtful that let's not rush to get the liquefier ramped up, because you could actually have a much bigger detrimental impact, both from a near-term and a long-term standpoint.
Very detailed answer.
You've taught me well. I'm understanding technology, Randy. Yes, Jeff.
Hey, Sanjay. I think the Georgia facility uses a chart liquefaction equipment.
Yeah.
Texas will use the company you acquired in Texas.
Yeah.
Do they have the similar circuits and number of loops, or how the learnings and challenges you're having now repeatable are those?
Yeah, great question, Jeff. So this will help us in Louisiana, first of all, because it's a chart liquefier there, right? So Dan, you're sitting there. Do you want to take that question rather than me take it? Come on up.
Yeah, so the plug liquefaction system is different. So we utilize the actual hydrogen that we're producing at the site as the refrigerant in the liquefaction section. So there are some differences, but we are, we do get significant energy savings and operational savings and less complexity with the plug liquefier.
So I think Jeff's question, though, Danny, was do we have similar circuit, similar dry out process, right?
The dry out process is the same,
Okay.
right? So you're still having to dry out the orthopara catalyst that's inside the brazed aluminum heat exchanger.
Yeah.
But there are some similarities, like the pre-cooling cycle is both nitrogen, so there's a nitrogen compressor on ours as well as on the chart liquefaction. But yeah, we will definitely be taking advantage of the similarities.
Thanks, Bob. Yes, sir. Yes, Bob.
This morning, Andy mentioned a little bit about seeing demand from nuclear operators for electrolyzers.
Yeah.
Anything you could maybe expound on there?
Actually, the person who's so I think let me think about what can I share here. Yes, we have activities going on, right? And some of this activity probably will get unlocked as we get better clarity on the guidance from the Treasury in terms of the IRA. what the PTC situation looks like. Do you actually get additionality or lack thereof? And when Andy mentioned that waiting for some of the clarity on the Treasury guidance related to Inflation Reduction Act, certainly there are some of the opportunity that are sitting in the pipeline before it actually completely moves ahead, waiting for some of this clarity. So look, we believe that for the green hydrogen, nuclear has to be a part of the mix, absolutely. And so we have some of those discussions going on, and hopefully the policy is going to be comprehensive and wholesome that benefits everybody, and more importantly benefits the green hydrogen industry, rather than trying to accomplish something that actually derails the industry, if you would, right, and pushes it out by 5 years. Any other questions? Or? Yeah, so we've actually done the pre-engineering work already, right? I think, based on everything that has happened there, right? One of the debate that we're actually having internally is should we actually do a same 5 megawatt skids, or should we actually think about maybe doing a 10 megawatt skids? That's one piece, right? And we already have a liquefaction 15-ton that is actually going to be what Danny just talked about, hydrogen loop. It's going to be more energy efficient, right? So we have not decided on exactly going ahead and issuing a full turnkey EPC yet. We're at the design phase for the phase 2, but once we actually award that EPC contract, given everything we've learned, we believe that it's next 12 to 13 months after that. And we're actually, at the final stages of negotiating exactly when we want to issue that EPC contract. And by the way, guys, right, I often get questions on offtake and things like that. I mean, the reason, if we want to sell out our Georgia plants by multiple factors, we could. Right? There's so much demand. There's so many folks that are asking us, can you do this many tons of offtake with us, that many tons of offtake with us? It's been very intentional on our part to really preserve that capacity for our own use, because in the near term, building the green hydrogen plant is really more about expanding margin rather than really trying to capture some of that top line growth. Yes, sir.
Substation timeframe for New York. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so the latest, so I have a weekly call with the senior leadership team at New York Power Authority, myself, because it's important that we stay on top of that. The last feedback that we have from them is that it is going to be between August to December of 2024 when they believe that they're going to get substation done. There's a school of thought they think that they can actually get it done in August, but there's some group that are actually saying it might actually go all the way to December. Right, so that's the window that we've been given, and one of the things we've done because of that is we've actually taken a bit of a step back. We already have all the long lead time items there, right? So there is no need to actually do a lot more foundation and things like that work here in the near term. We feel like we can actually do that even next year. So that's really the latest time frame we have from them, and and I think another thing that's very important for everybody to keep in mind is it's not just about getting the substation built. There are a bunch of windows that they're going to have to negotiate with New York ISO when they put that substation online, if you would, right? But that's the latest that we have. Sure, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Can I ask about the flora and fauna associated with the land use, primarily because of solar and wind and everything else you have to add? Not necessarily electrolysis plant, that's a small footprint in comparison to everything else. This is a general question for all sustainable development, but in some places it might be worse. I think Georgia and Louisiana, where you have so much trees and growth and everything else, it's not as bad as in Oklahoma, for example. I don't know. And are you running into challenges with regard to this?
Kevin's sitting back there. Are you running into any other challenges, Kevin? You run the project development effort. You want to take that question? I have my views, but.
Yeah, I think we're renewable developers in general.
Yes.
They're trying to do the right thing. So
Yeah.
look at some of the land we're using in Texas. Even there. First of all, not all land is farmable. Not all, a lot
Correct.
of this land is pretty
Exactly.
disturbed.
Right.
We're looking at some sites in the Panhandle, Texas, that are there's good water resources there, but it's just out. The sloping of it isn't good for farming. These other types of things. In California, we've got previously disturbed land that was contaminated by over fertilization.
Yeah.
In Georgia, we're not co-located with a production facility there. It's absolutely something that not just us, but when we work with renewable developer partners, my experience has been that they're sensitive to these things. You have to get in front of the town council to explain what's going on, why it's going on, how you're going to be a good neighbor for 30 years. So we're doing that as responsibly as we can, and I think the industry as a whole is doing well. And
Yeah.
if you look at the projections of the amount of renewables that are supposed to go up, in the country relative to even the most optimistic forecasts of electrolysis, it's still a small fraction.
Yeah.
So, we're a bit away from paving the United States facility.
Yeah, I think we might have time for one last question, right, Paul? I think we are kind of out of time.
Make it a good one.
Yep.
If it's 2028 and we look back 5 years and the footprint is drastically different than what you laid out here, what would have gone wrong?
What would have gone wrong? For some reason that we can't think about, that we didn't get the renewable pricing, renewable procurement right. That's one. Right? Second is we don't anticipate this, but since this was a question, what could go wrong? We certainly don't think so. If anything, I think we're in a very unique position than anybody else. If there are any scale-up dynamics on either our electrolyzer business or our liquefier business, that could push things out potentially, right? But one thing though, I don't think it's so much that what could go wrong. Could that map look a little bit different than the way we think about it right now? It's possible. We're absolutely going to be opportunistic about that, right? Because I think Kevin's done a great job running the development team where you don't want to get married to one project and fall in love with that project. If there are going to be challenges that's going to come down the road, you got to cut the bait, move on, and actually find another opportunity, right? So in that dot, you might actually see multiple plants in Panhandle, in West Texas. We might actually not have any plant in the West Coast because we might realize that it was better to produce that hydrogen in West Texas, move it to California, than actually building a plant in California, because it just did not make any sense from a permitting standpoint or the cost of power standpoint to build that plant, right? I don't think it's going to be so much about what went wrong. I think the mix of that map could very much be very different than the way we're thinking about it right now, and that I think is going to be largely hopefully we're being thoughtful about, like, for example, right, we had a project in Holtwood, Pennsylvania, and we had actually spent about a couple $100,000. Then we ran into a phase 2 environmental permit. Then we realized there was going to be an endangered species. Then at that point, we said it was time to move on. So that's not on the map anymore, right? So while we will have generation capacity, generation assets, the national network that is being built, where exactly they are, absolutely. Oh, by the way, it is going to be, I'm sure, different than what we have here right now, but I think it's really going to be more about that. Okay. Great. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.